It only took 100 seconds to change everything. April 29th of 1903. It's early morning in the small mining town of Frank, Alberta, Canada. The sky is still dark, the air is cold, and most of the town is sound asleep. There's a quiet rhythm to a place like this, where life revolves around the mine, the trains, and the steady routine of work and rest. Nothing about this moment feels unusual. Nothing feels dangerous. And yet, high above the town, something has already begun to shift. Turtle Mountain stands just to the south, massive and silent, its steep limestone face rising over the valley. For years, it has shown signs that something was not quite right. Small tremors had been felt. Miners working deep underground had noticed cracks forming in its supports. There had been sounds, faint and unsettling, like the mountain was adjusting itself. Even long before the town existed, the local communities had refused to camp near it, calling the mountain that moves. It was a place where coal meant opportunity, and those warnings were easy to overlook. Frank itself was new, founded just a couple years earlier. It had grown quickly, fueled by the promise of work and the energy of a frontier town. By early 1903, around 600 people lived here. There were homes, a school, several hotels, and a steady flow of trains coming and going. It was the kind of place where people believed they would build something lasting, something secure for their future. At around 4:10 in the morning, that sense of security completely disappeared. The first sign was a sound. It was not a sharp crack or a sudden explosion, but a deep, rolling rumble that seemed to come up from everywhere at once. It grew louder in seconds. It turned into a roar that completely filled the valley. For those who were awake, it was confusing at first. For those who were asleep, it was something they would never fully understand. At that exact moment, a freight train was moving away from the mine. The crew heard the sound behind them and did not hesitate. The engineer pushed the throttle forward, accelerating as fast as he could. He did not need to see what was happening to know it was serious enough. The train raced toward the bridge over the river, crossing it just seconds before the structure was destroyed completely behind them. What followed was not gradual, but immediate. Millions of tons of limestone broke free from Turtle Mountain and surged down into the valley. The mass of rocks was enormous, stretching across a wide section of the mountain. It moved with such incredible speed, it covered the distance in roughly 100 seconds. That's less time than it takes to listen to a single song. In that brief window, an entire section of this town was completely buried. Homes were crushed instantly. Buildings disappeared beneath the rock. The railway line was torn apart and buried. Dust and debris filled the air, making it nearly impossible to see. The sound alone was overwhelming, heard miles away by people who had no idea what had just happened. About 100 people had been directly in the path of this slide. Some were awake, many were not. The destruction was so sudden that there was little chance to react. The official death toll was estimated between 70 and 90, though the exact number has never been fully confirmed. Some victims were never even recovered. Their remains are still buried beneath a massive field of rocks that lays out there even now. But while the devastation above ground was immediate and visible, something different was happening below. Inside the mine, 17 men were working the night shift. When the slide hit, they felt the impact, but they were not crushed. Instead, they found themselves trapped instantly. The main entrance to the mine was completely blocked. Another passage had also collapsed. Water from the river began to seep into the tunnels, and the air started to grow thick and dangerous. They were alive, but they were running out of time. There was no immediate rescue. There was no quick solution. The men understood that if they waited, they would die where they stood. So they made the decision that would define their survival. They would have to dig their way out. In darkness, with limited tools and fading energy, they began to carve through this coal. Working in small groups and taking turns, they pushed forward inch by inch by inch, and hours passed. The air grew worse. Exhaustion set in. At one point, only a few of them still had enough strength to continue. Then, after 13 long, painful, brutal hours of digging, something changed. A small opening appeared. Light broke through. It was not large, and it was not safe, but it was enough to prove that escape was possible. They adjusted their efforts, carving a new path that would allow them to reach the surface more securely. And finally, one by one, all 17 men emerged from this mountain. What they expected to find was relief, and what they found instead was something much harder. The town they had left behind only hours earlier was no longer the same. Entire sections of it were now gone. Homes were destroyed. Entire families had been lost. For some of the men, survival came with an immediate and devastating cost. One miner discovered that his family had survived. Another learned that his wife and children had not. There were other stories like this throughout the town. A young girl survived because she had been working a late shift away from home. Others were saved by chance, by timing, by small decisions that placed them just outside of the path of destruction. At the same time, entire groups of people were lost, including workers in a nearby camp who had no opportunity to escape. And yet, even in the midst of this, life continued to push forward. Rescue efforts, of course, began quickly. Doctors and officials arrived by train. The railway, buried under rock, was cleared and rebuilt within weeks. The mine itself reportedly opened shortly afterward, despite the obvious risks. In fact, the town not only recovered, but for a time, it grew. By 1906, its population had nearly doubled. But the mountain never stopped being a concern. Studies did show that Turtle Mountain remained unstable. Cracks continued to form. The same conditions that had caused the slide were still present. Eventually, parts of the town closest to the mountain were moved to safer ground. And over time, as the mine became less profitable and eventually closed in 1917, the town of Frank began to fade. Today, what remains is quiet. The field of rock is definitely still there. It's largely unchanged since that morning in 1903. It stretches across this vast valley, a frozen moment of destruction that has not been cleared away or softened by time. Many bodies are still missing beneath the rubble. It is now a place that people visit, a site that draws attention not because it's changed, but rather because it hasn't. Standing there, it's difficult not to think about how quickly everything had happened. One moment, a town was completely intact, full of life and routine and families, and the next it was partially buried under millions of tons of rock. There were no warning sirens. There were no evacuations. There was just a series of small signs that in hindsight pointed to something much larger on the horizon. And that may be the most unsettling part of the story. The warnings were there. The cracks, the tremors, the stories passed down from those who had come before. But they were easy to ignore, easy to explain away in the face of opportunity and daily life. That is, until they were not. So here's the question I want you to think about. And I want you to answer this in the comments because this is one of those moments that really makes you reflect on human nature and decision making. If you had lived in the town of Frank and seen those warning signs, and nobody had told you what those warning signs were, would you have stayed for the promise of work and future? Or would you have walked away from it all for your safety, not knowing if you had another job lined up tomorrow? And if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching.